very much for that. Let me now move on to introduce James Pawlowski from University of Pennsylvania, the Director of Education of the MAPS program, a PhD in philosophy, which is an interesting one because most of us here are psychologists, but that philosophical background perhaps gives James a bit more perspective. I think back to one of my heroes is William James, and he was probably more of a philosopher than a psychologist at the time, and William James gave us wonderful perspective and a starting base, and perhaps our James brings forth some of that insight as well. Founding director of MAPS at University of Pennsylvania, keynote speakers at major conferences all over the world. I could just imagine the number of frequent flyer points that he must have. It seems like he is asked to give presentations and apparently doesn't know how to say no because he's constantly flying around the world. However, for us, his most important contribution perhaps has been the founding and perhaps the only executive director of IPA. And this has been a huge undertaking. Probably a lot of you don't realize that in IPA, we don't have a paid executive director. So James is doing this completely as a voluntary operation and undoubtedly paying a price for it. When I started exploring issues about what IPA was, what it could be, what it had been, all those roads led back to James. He was described as the archive, the memory. Also, I like somebody describing him as the CPU, the working memory and the operational side of our organization. When anybody has any questions, they go to him. He's the can-do, will-do person for the organization, and we owe him a tremendous contribution because of that. But without talking any further and wasting precious time, let me go ahead and turn the podium over to him. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. So, is it okay to be a philosopher here? For the last 15 years, I have been a philosopher embedded among psychologists. I was attracted to positive psychology because so many of the themes and topics that are investigated in this field are similar to ones that philosophers have been investigating for a little longer than 17 and a half years, maybe a couple millennia. And yet, I was intrigued by the new empirical approaches that were being taken by positive psychologists. And so I was delighted when I first got to know Marty Seligman and Chris Peterson and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi some 15 years ago to discover that Marty Seligman, as an undergraduate, majored in, can you guess? Philosophy. And of course, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is a polymath. And so I felt very much at home. I am deeply indebted to Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, particularly when I was just starting out in the field. I looked much more like a philosopher then, with a ponytail in the back and slicked back hair. It worried some that I was joining the crowd. But Mihai was very generous in supporting me personally and connections with philosophy at that time, and I'm deeply grateful. It's a great honor to share this stage with him today. So, how many of you, if you dare make a similar confession to I, how many of you are involved in philosophy or the humanities or the arts? Can I see your hands? Wow, a lot of us. So I think that there ought to be more dialogue between positive psychology and the arts and the humanities, which is why I am delighted to be able to talk with you this afternoon on the topic of the positive humanities, a new approach to human flourishing. Now, when I talk about the humanities, I also intend by that the arts. The arts are also a very powerful means of transformation of human experience. I read not too long ago an article in the New York Times about a woman named Julie who walked into an art museum and was strangely attracted by this work by Toulouse-Lautrec. And she decided to spend some time in front of this painting. And as she did, she began to observe the emotions portrayed here. The person here seems sad, she noticed. And as Julie was thinking about that, she realized she herself felt sad. And she wondered why. And as she continued to think, she realized she was sad because she did not feel engaged at work. And as she continued in front of the painting, she also noticed that the subject here was not only sad, but also determined. And furthermore, Julie noticed that behind the subject was a window, a way of escape. And so Julie thought, I too can be determined. I too can find a way to make a change in my own life. And she went back home and put in a request for a transfer to a different part of her organization where she is now able to flourish and bring forward much more of who she is in her work. The transformative power of art. Art is also transformative in the lives of children. This is my son, Liam, and Liam is right over there. Hi, Liam. My wife Susie and I love Liam very much. We also, just to show you how dedicated, how right Herb's introduction was of me, those of you who know me well know that I am a fan of William James, so much so that Liam's official name is William James Pawelski. We call him Liam for short. Liam loves art. He likes to draw. His favorite subject these days, I think, is drawing storms. He does a great job of drawing storms with the rain and the lightning. Here's a picture of us at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam last summer, where we found a sculpture of an eagle. Liam also really loves animals, and so it was fun to find a sculpture of an eagle. In addition to art, Liam really likes books. He loves literature. Stuart Little. How many of you are familiar with the story Stuart Little? So I read this book to Liam not long ago, and we both thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a story about a boy who grows up to be a mouse. Liam also loves movies. Some of his favorite involve a certain monkey who has one of his signature strengths as a part of his name, Curious George. And Liam also loves music. It's a delight to Susie and me to hear Liam singing around the house as he's playing or whatever he's doing. It's just a wonderful, wonderful thing to hear. Art, literature, movies, music. Anyone else here a fan of these things? Excellent. So what I'd like to invite you to do, just for a moment, is to think about a particular one of these, a particular cultural artifact that is important for your well-being. A piece of art, literature, a movie, or a song or piece of music. Think about something in particular and why that has been so important to you in your own well-being. And now I'd like to invite you just to take a minute or two to share with your neighbor, share with each other what that particular thing is that has been so important for your well-being. Okay, great. Well done. Well done. Wow. I am convinced that there are fans of the arts and the humanities here. How many of you chose music? Wow, that's a lot. Great. How many of you chose a movie? Excellent. How many of you chose literature, like a novel or a poem? Excellent. And did any of you choose visual art, painting or sculpture? Wonderful. Did anybody choose something else that I didn't mention? Okay, excellent, excellent. So these music, movies, literature, visual art are some of the most common of the humanities. Others include performance art, theater and dance, philosophy, a personal favorite of mine, history, religion, ancient and modern languages, and law. There is so much power in these humanities and in these arts. And yet, to this point, it's a power that positive psychology, research and practice hasn't really tapped into, hasn't really engaged with like it might. One of the reasons might be because of the way students often respond to courses in these areas. So often when students study literature or history, the connections aren't made to their own worlds, to their own well-beings. And so their response is a response of boredom. Perhaps related to that are the economic pressures that are brought to bear on programs in music and art in schools, for example, where they're vulnerable to cuts. Departments at the university level are shut down. Policymakers, sometimes themselves governors of states in this country, for example, or members of Congress, are continually trying to cut down the budget for the arts and the humanities. This is why I think it's high time for the positive humanities. It's high time for us to connect the power that we all feel in our own lives for these amazing parts of human experience with the science of well-being. It's time for us to work together to advance the well-being value of the humanities. I think there are two particular ways in which we might go about doing this. The first is what I'll call the eudaimonic turn, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. The second is a strategic collaboration with the science of well-being, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well in just a few minutes. So first of all, the eudaimonic turn. What do I mean by the eudaimonic turn? Eudaimonia, as you no doubt know, is the Greek term for well-being or flourishing. It's oftentimes translated as happiness, but it means more than just hedonic happiness. It means a broader kind of doing well, living a life well lived. So in this eudaimonic turn in the humanities, it's very important to emphasize the connection between the humanities and human flourishing. Now, there are many different uses to which the arts and the humanities can be put. Some of them are economic. It seems like very frequently we're reading about a brand new record being set for the amount of money paid for a work of a painting by a private collector, right? Millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars being paid for paintings. Other kinds of people who are professionals in these areas also have to think about the economic impact of the arts and the humanities. So there's an economic use. There's also a professional use. So if you're a professional singer, or you're a professional artist, or if you are in the university and you are a professor of the arts or the humanities, you need to think about the professional value that they have, how you can use them, study them, learn about them, in part to help you advance professionally. I'm not intending to critique the financial value or the professional value. What I am trying to do, though, is to say that we need to make more room for the well-being value, the ways in which the arts and the humanities can help support our human flourishing. It's also important to emphasize the value of the humanities for increasing well-being. 2 years ago, a colleague of mine and I, D.J. Moores, who is a literature professor, co-edited an anthology called The Eudaimonic Turn. And in it, we examined the state of literary studies with regard to well-being. What we found there is all too common across the humanities. The situation actually is somewhat familiar, or would be somewhat familiar to those of us in positive psychology. 18, 20 years ago, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, Marty Seligman observed that there was a great imbalance between the amount of time dedicated to the mitigation of ill-being versus the amount of time dedicated to the promotion of well-being. Similarly, the situation across much of the humanities and the arts today focuses on critique, on suspicion, on looking for works of literature or works of art to see what kinds of pernicious ideologies are embedded in them. What latent sexism or racism can be found and discovered and made public. Now, I don't mean to denigrate that activity any more than positive psychologists denigrate the important activity of mitigating ill-being. And at the same time, I want to make room for the positive side, for the direct paying attention to how we can use the arts and the humanities to increase well-being. In addition to the eudaimonic turn, I think we should engage in a collaboration between the humanities and the science of well-being. If we do so, I believe there are tremendous benefits to be had. First of all, there are benefits for science. One area in which science can benefit is in the area of conceptual analysis. I have to confess to you that as a philosopher, I'm astonished that positive psychology is some 17 years old, and to this point, no one has published a robust analysis of its most basic concept, the positive. As a consequence, the positive is used in various ways in different dimensions, by some researchers in some ways, by others in others, by practitioners. And so there's a kind of confusion that can arise because we haven't taken the time to do the necessary conceptual analysis. I'm very familiar with some of this confusion because I've spent the last several months or couple of years trying to dig into this. And I have written a paper on defining the positive in positive psychology. And I'm very happy to report that we are making plans for a special issue on the Journal of Positive Psychology to examine this very important question. Remember that during the session on the critiques of positive psychology a couple of days ago, it was mentioned the critique of we need to define our terms better, terms like well-being and so forth. And I think we need to start with the positive. So the science can benefit from the work of philosophers and other humanities scholars in the work of conceptual analysis. Also at the level of robust concepts, I'll just take one example to illustrate what I mean. How many of you here are familiar with hope theory? So C.R. Snyder developed the hope theory. He wrote a book called The Psychology of Hope. Wonderful book, wonderful theory, has been used in many settings, including education. Shane Lopez was here during this conference and is a leader in this field. And hope theory involves three basic components: goal setting, motivation, and creativity in achieving one's goals. This, I think, is a wonderful construct, and yet if we think about the notion of hope in literature, in philosophy over the last several millennia, I don't think anybody would argue that hope theory captures all of what we mean culturally by hope. Not too long ago, one of my colleagues, a philosopher at the University of Pennsylvania, published a book called How We Hope, A Moral Psychology. I doubt there's a measurable sentence in that book because it was written by a philosopher. But I wonder what would happen if positive psychologists interested in the psychology of hope and philosophers interested in the philosophy of hope would get together. And might we develop a whole range of new and very robust constructs to study? Third, I think this collaboration might help us to measure more and more meaningful things. Scientists like to measure things, and humanities scholars like to engage, like to explore the meanings of things. And if we got together bringing our own strengths, we might indeed be able to measure more and more meaningful things. Finally, we might be able to develop a whole new class of positive interventions. I began my talk by referring to Julie, the woman I read about in the New York Times. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about her at this point. Her name is actually Julie Hayslip, and she's a graduate of the Master of Applied Positive Psychology program that I direct and teach in at the University of Pennsylvania. The museum she entered was the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. The reason she went into that museum is because she was on a field trip in the class I teach on the humanities and human flourishing. The reason she spent that time in front of this painting is because she was fulfilling an assignment. I had given them a positive intervention assignment. Now, how many of you have seen, nobody in here has done that, but how many of you, when visiting a museum, have ever seen folks who seem like they're really in a rush to get to the one or two most famous paintings in the museum so they can take a selfie and then be on their way, well, post it on Facebook, and then be on their way to the next thing, right? So the question is, what if we thought about the well-being value of a museum, not just the social desirability value of having the most selfies with the most famous paintings on your Facebook account, but the well-being value. So I asked my students to go into this museum and to walk around and see what painting really seemed to speak to them, and then to spend at least 20 minutes in front of that painting. Oftentimes, when we go into a museum, we think we're seeing the art, but people spend on average 15 to 30 seconds in front of a painting. That would be kind of like walking into a library and walking down one of the shelves, looking at the spines of the books, and getting to the end and saying, wow, I sure did read a lot of books today. You can't see a painting really in 15 to 30 seconds any more than you can read a book simply by looking at its spine. It takes time to dialogue with what's going on. And in the case of Julie Hayslip, Dr. Julie Hayslip, she is a pediatric intensive care specialist who was working at the University of Virginia Medical Center and was just not feeling engaged anymore in her work. As a result of this intervention, she went home and requested a transfer to the School of Nursing, where she is much more able to use what she's learned in positive psychology and to be engaged herself in her work. So again, intentional interventions using positive psychology, and by the way, it's really a bargain, because the entry fee to getting into the Barnes is about $20, and you get access to $30 billion worth of art. That's like a $30 billion positive intervention for 20 bucks. I think the humanities can also stand to benefit from such a collaboration between the humanities and the science of well-being. First of all, we can learn to unlock more of the well-being value of the humanities. Earlier, I showed you a picture depicting what students all too often feel when they are in humanities classes. Imagine classes that are taught very differently. Imagine classes that are informed by the best in positive psychology research. Imagine classes, for example, in the philosophy department on logic and critical thinking. Typically, and I've taught a lot of these classes myself, typically we focus in on arguments that we can find in letters to the editor or in blogs. But it doesn't occur to us to think about the arguments that are made subconsciously in our own minds. And so could the skills that students are learning in logic and critical thinking classes be used to help them to good effect to practice their learned optimism? Imagine courses in creative writing, for example, that benefit from the work of Jamie Pennebaker and Lisa King and others who are working on understanding the value of writing about either traumatic events or positive events, and doing it in such a way that there are incredible positive outcomes psychologically and physically as well. Or the best possible future self, Jane Dutton and others developing that. What if those were taken into creative writing classes, increasing the students' skills in creative writing while at the same time making it likely that they will also learn and benefit from psychological skills as well? I'll just take one more example. What about theater classes? What about acting classes where students learn already so much about the somatic components? We've heard about the importance of physiology and well-being. Students learn about emotion regulation. Actors are so good at emotion regulation. They're so good at somatic regulation and awareness. And yet, all too seldom do they connect this to their world off the stage. I mean, talk about character development. The experts on any college campus on character development are the thespians, because they develop character all the time. But we think of that as character in the theater, and we don't typically connect it to character in life. The work of Amy Cuddy and others is showing that the way we stand, the way we are in the world, our postures communicate to others, but perhaps way more importantly, they communicate to us. And they can be ways that we can harness this for our own well-being. And then secondly, wouldn't it be great to be able to document these results? Again, I don't need to make this argument in this room where we're convinced by the power of the humanities, but many decision makers may not have these experiences or may be faced with tough budget decisions and have to decide between, investing in areas of education that already have robust data showing why they're important, and the humanities, which we all like, but do they really help us in the long run? So if we could develop data about not just the financial value of the arts and the humanities, not just the professional value, but their well-being value, this could be enormously important. So I think a collaboration between the humanities and the science of well-being would be important. It would benefit science, it would benefit the humanities, but far more importantly, it would benefit humanity. Imagine being able to link forces, to be able to understand, to be able to cultivate, and to be able to measure well-being much more effectively. Hard to put it any better than Norman Rockwell did in this painting. I'm excited to report that there is already some progress in this domain. I'm enormously grateful to the Templeton Religion Trust for its support of giving a grant on the topic of the humanities and the science of well-being toward a strategic collaboration for understanding, measuring, and cultivating well-being. One of the things that this grant has enabled us to do is to organize a planning meeting earlier this year, where we invited humanities scholars and social scientists to come together to talk about these matters. We had an historian from Dartmouth. We had a theologian from Yale Divinity School. We had a music history professor from the University of Pennsylvania. We had a literary studies scholar from the University of Virginia and the chair of the philosophy department at Emory University. And then we had some social scientists. Marty Seligman joined us. Barry Schwartz joined us. And we were privileged to have Louis Tay, who is a professor at Purdue University. Is Louis here today? Would you please stand, Louis? Louis is our research director on this project. Thank you, Louis. We were also joined by the assistant chairman at the National Endowment for the Humanities and by someone from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, the education director. It was an amazing conversation where we were all excited about the importance of joining forces to effect a eudaimonic turn and to realize some of these possibilities as we move forward. These are some of the individuals who are involved in this project. I'm grateful to the growing number of others who've been involved in a variety of ways. So what are our next steps at this point? We're working on a mission statement, a position statement, specifically with the humanities scholars that were at the planning meeting earlier this year, to provide a kind of DNA for what we mean by this as we move forward. Louis Tay and I are working on a conceptual paper. Some of you hopefully were able to attend his talk earlier this weekend about this matter. A conceptual paper to try to get a sense of what some of the variables, the dependent, independent variables, some of the mechanisms might be going on here to begin the research. And then he and I, along with a team of researchers, are working on systematic reviews and meta-analyses where we're looking to the effect sizes of the humanities on subjective well-being and psychological well-being. We're starting with a few key areas: music, performance art, philosophy, literature, and history, and also religion. We're excited about expanding this now. We have a plan for a mixed methods research program to carry this forward using big data, using qualitative research, using quantitative research. So, we are looking for collaborators. So if this is something that appeals to you, if this is something that you also feel that would be an important thing to move forward, we want to connect with you. You may be a researcher, you may be somebody who is connected with an individual, a group, or an organization that is a key leader in this area. We're also looking for foundations or corporations or individuals who would like to provide further funding for this new field of endeavor. If you'd like to be in contact with us on any of these matters, please feel free to send us an email at positivehumanitiesresearch@gmail.com. Again, positivehumanitiesresearch@gmail.com. This is an endeavor that obviously will take an enormous collaborative effort to be able to succeed in. Take a moment now to think back to where we began, to the cultural artifact that you identified as being important in your own life. Whether it was a work of art, literature, a movie, music, or something else. And think about how important that has been in your own life. Imagine with me for a moment a world in which we have greater access to the incredible treasure that we have accumulated over the last thousands of years from so many cultures. Imagine if we were able to access the well-being value of these treasures much more effectively. And imagine if we were able to measure in robust ways the effects for individual, community, and global well-being from this work. This, I think, is the vision of the positive humanities. And I think it is indeed a robust and promising new approach to human flourishing.